Some people don't realize they're standing in front of a turning point until it's already too late. The Harbor Diner was supposed to be just another quiet stop along the waterfront, the kind of place where salt from the ocean clung to the windows and conversation stayed low. Emily Carter sat near the back corner, hands folded, eyes calm, as if the noise of the world had already learned to pass her by. Most people who saw her would have assumed weakness at first glance, the wheelchair, the stillness, the way she avoided drawing attention. But Marcus Hale noticed her differently. He didn't see silence as peace, he saw it as permission. He and his men entered like they owned the air itself, their laughter too loud for the room, their presence shifting the entire atmosphere. Conversations faded, forks paused midair, and heads turned away on instinct. Emily didn't move. That was what irritated Marcus the most. He leaned toward her table, studying her like a problem he intended to solve for entertainment, while his men circled loosely behind him. "You always sit like this?" he asked, voice casual but sharp underneath. No answer came. That silence made him smile. He tapped the edge of her table, just enough to make a point, watching for any reaction. Nothing. Then one of his men noticed something small, a thin metallic tag partially hidden beneath the edge of her jacket. It wasn't flashy, but it wasn't ordinary either. The man squinted, uncertain, and that uncertainty alone changed the rhythm of the room. Marcus followed his gaze and slowly reached forward, curiosity turning into intent. Emily's hand shifted slightly, not in fear, not in defense, but in quiet awareness. From a nearby booth, an older veteran narrowed his eyes, his attention locking onto the tag with a recognition he didn't fully understand yet. His breath slowed. His hand moved toward his pocket, and in that moment, something subtle but irreversible began to form in the air, as if the room itself had just started waiting for something it could not yet see coming. Marcus Hale kept his attention locked on the small metallic tag, as if it had suddenly become the only interesting thing in the room. His expression shifting from amusement to something more focused and irritated, the kind of curiosity that came from sensing he was missing a detail others had not explained to him. Emily Carter remained still, her posture controlled, her hands resting calmly in her lap, giving away nothing that could be used against her in that moment. The silence around the table grew heavier as the nearby veteran slowly leaned forward, pretending to adjust his drink while actually studying the tag with increasing intensity. His eyes narrowing as fragments of recognition began to surface in his memory, without fully forming into certainty. Marcus noticed the veteran's attention again and let out a short laugh, trying to regain control of the atmosphere by turning it into something casual, something that belonged to him, and he tapped the table once more as he spoke in a louder voice meant for everyone nearby, asking where someone like her would even get something like that, implying it was either stolen or meaningless decoration. A few of his men chuckled on cue, but the sound lacked confidence, as if they were reacting more to him than to the situation itself. Emily finally shifted slightly, not in response to Marcus, but to adjust the edge of her jacket so the tag was less visible, a subtle movement that only made the veteran's attention sharpen further. He reached slowly into his pocket, not fully aware yet of what he was about to do, only certain that what he was seeing did not belong in a casual diner conversation. Marcus leaned closer to Emily's side of the table, lowering his voice just enough to create pressure rather than conversation, asking her directly who she used to work for, as if he expected her silence to confirm his suspicion that she was nothing important. The veteran's hand paused halfway inside his pocket, as if he had found something cold and unexpected, and his breathing changed slightly as he began to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the situation in front of him. Outside the large glass windows of the diner, the harbor traffic continued as normal, but inside, the atmosphere had already started to shift into something quieter, sharper, and far more uncertain, as if the room itself was waiting for a confirmation it was not ready to understand. The veteran's hand finally pulled back from his pocket, but his attention did not leave the small metallic tag for even a second, as if stopping now would mean ignoring something his instincts had already started to understand. Marcus Hale noticed the shift in the man's behavior and grew more impatient, mistaking caution for fear, and he let out a short, dismissive breath as he leaned further into Emily Carter's space, pressing again for an answer with a tone that was less curious and more demanding. Emily remained composed, her eyes steady and unreadable, but there was a subtle tightening in her posture now. Not fear, but awareness, the kind that came when a situation began to move in directions she had already seen before. The veteran slowly exhaled, then quietly stood up from his seat, drawing just enough attention to create a pause in the room, and for the first time Marcus glanced away from Emily to look at him directly, annoyed at the interruption. The veteran raised one hand slightly, not in confrontation, but in hesitation, as if he was still deciding whether what he suspected was real or not. And then he spoke in a low voice, asking Emily a simple question about the origin of the tag, a question that carried more weight than it seemed to at first hearing. Marcus rolled his eyes and mocked the moment under his breath, but the tone in the veteran's voice was no longer something he could easily dismiss, because it lacked uncertainty in all the ways that mattered. Emily's fingers lightly touched the edge of the tag again, and for the first time, she did not immediately hide it. Outside the diner windows, the harbor light shifted as a large vehicle passed slowly along the street, its presence unnoticed by most inside, except for a slight change in the reflection across the glass. The veteran's expression tightened as fragments of memory finally aligned into recognition, not complete understanding, but enough to make him hesitate before speaking again. Marcus sensed the change and tried to regain control of the moment with a sharper tone, demanding that Emily explain herself or stop wasting his time. But his voice now carried less confidence than before. The air inside the diner had shifted completely, not louder, not more violent, but heavier, as if something unseen had already begun to move closer, and no one at the table was still fully in control of what would happen next. The veteran remained standing near the table, his eyes fixed on the small metallic tag, as if it had begun to reveal more than just its surface, his expression now carrying a quiet tension that had not been there moments before. Marcus Hale noticed the shift again and grew visibly more irritated, interpreting the hesitation as weakness rather than understanding that something in the room was beginning to move beyond his control. He leaned back slightly, forcing a short laugh as he tried to reset the atmosphere, but it did not land the way he expected, because even his own men were no longer fully reacting with confidence. Emily Carter remained seated, her posture unchanged, but her awareness had sharpened, and her gaze now subtly tracked the veteran rather than Marcus, recognizing that something in him had shifted from curiosity to recognition. The veteran slowly lowered his head for a moment, then looked back up at Emily and asked a second question, quieter than before, not demanding but careful, as if the answer carried weight far beyond the diner walls. Marcus cut him off mid-sentence, telling him to stop acting strange and to sit back down, his frustration growing as control over the moment continued to slip. But the veteran did not sit. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, this time deliberately, pulling out a worn communication device that looked out of place in such a casual environment. He hesitated for only a second before initiating a call, his voice low and controlled as he spoke a brief coded confirmation into the device, mentioning only 2 words that caused a subtle change in his expression: Black Anchor. Emily's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly at the mention, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her sleeve, not in fear, but in acknowledgment of something long buried. Outside the large glass windows, a slow movement of dark vehicles became visible along the harbor road, their presence still distant but unmistakably coordinated. Inside, the diner's background noise seemed to soften, as if attention itself had begun to concentrate toward the entrance. Marcus noticed the change in the veteran's focus and followed his gaze toward the windows, his confidence flickering for the first time as he saw shapes forming outside that did not match the casual rhythm of the street. The veteran exhaled slowly, his voice now almost a whisper as he said that certain names were not supposed to resurface, And in that moment, the air inside the diner shifted into something heavy with anticipation, as if whatever was about to arrive had already been set in motion long before any of them entered the room. Marcus Hale noticed the veteran's hand tighten slightly around the communication device, and for the first time since entering the diner, his expression shifted from arrogance into something closer to uncertainty, though he quickly tried to mask it with a short, forced laugh that did not carry the same confidence as before. Emily Carter remained still, but her attention was now fully divided between the veteran and the faint reflections forming in the diner windows, where dark shapes outside seemed to pause rather than pass like normal traffic. The veteran kept his focus low, speaking quietly into the device again, confirming a second time the same coded phrase, and then stopping as if waiting for something that did not require further explanation. Marcus stepped closer to the table, demanding to know what was being communicated, his voice sharper now, but there was a subtle hesitation behind it that even his own men began to notice. One of the gangsters looked toward the windows and squinted, his earlier confidence replaced with confusion as he pointed out that the vehicles outside were not moving away. Emily's fingers slowly released tension from her sleeve, and she exhaled once, controlled and steady, as if acknowledging a moment she had already prepared for long before it arrived. The veteran finally looked at Marcus directly, no longer avoiding eye contact, and told him in a low voice that some situations could not be stopped once the confirmation had been made, a statement that caused a ripple of unease through the group. Marcus scoffed at the warning, but his eyes flicked toward the windows again, where the shapes outside were now clearly stationary, forming a quiet perimeter along the harbor street. Inside the diner, conversations from other tables had completely faded, replaced by silence broken only by the faint sound of distant engines idling. Emily remained composed, but her posture now carried a different kind of awareness, one that suggested she understood exactly what was approaching and had accepted it long before anyone else. The veteran lowered his device, slipping it back into his pocket with careful precision, and said only that recognition was no longer optional once the signal had been confirmed. At that moment, the diner's front entrance became the only point of focus in the entire room, as if every breath inside had been waiting for something to step through it, and Marcus, for the first time, stopped speaking entirely. The silence inside the diner had become so complete that even the smallest movements felt amplified, every breath carrying weight as all attention remained locked toward the entrance, where the expectation of something significant had fully taken over the room. Marcus Hale stood rigid near the table, his earlier confidence now replaced by a visible tension in his shoulders, as he tried to maintain control of a situation that no longer responded to his presence. Emily Carter remained seated exactly as before, but her calmness now felt different, not passive, but grounded in a recognition of timing, as if she had already lived through the moment that was about to unfold. The veteran slowly stepped half a pace back from the table, positioning himself in a way that placed him slightly between Marcus and Emily, not as a barrier, but as someone who understood the importance of what was coming. Outside, the faint reflections in the glass sharpened as movement aligned along the harbor street, and then the first vehicle came to a complete stop directly in front of the diner. No one inside spoke. The door remained closed for a brief moment that stretched far longer than it should have, and in that pause Marcus finally stopped pretending this was still something he could intimidate or dismiss. Emily's gaze shifted toward the entrance, steady and unblinking, while the veteran lowered his eyes slightly, as if acknowledging a protocol that had already been confirmed beyond reversal. Then the door opened. The sound was not loud, but it carried instantly through the entire room, changing the pressure in the air in a way that made several people instinctively straighten in their seats. The first figures entered without urgency, their movement controlled and deliberate, scanning the environment with trained precision rather than curiosity. Marcus instinctively took a step back without realizing it, his earlier bravado dissolving as he recognized that the room was no longer under his influence. Emily did not move, but her expression shifted subtly, not into surprise, but into confirmation, as if what she had been waiting for had finally arrived exactly as expected. The veteran exhaled once, quietly, and said under his breath that recognition was no longer a question. It was already in progress. The figures inside the doorway paused briefly, their attention aligning toward a single point in the room. And in that instant, the entire diner understood without words that everything from this moment forward would no longer follow the same rules as before. The moment the first figure inside the doorway fully stepped into the diner, the entire atmosphere tightened again, not through sound or movement, but through recognition that something far beyond a normal interruption had begun to unfold. Marcus Hale instinctively lowered his gaze for half a second, then forced it back up as if refusing to accept what his instincts were already telling him. Emily Carter remained perfectly still, but her attention was now fully aligned with the entrance. Her calm expression unchanged while her eyes carried a quiet certainty that suggested she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. The veteran stood slightly forward, his posture steady, no longer uncertain, but visibly aware that the situation had crossed a threshold where explanations would no longer be needed. The figures that entered did not speak immediately, instead spreading their attention across the room with controlled precision, each movement measured and deliberate, as if confirming details that were already known. Marcus tried to recover his authority by stepping forward half a pace, asking sharply who they were and why they were entering without explanation. But his voice lacked the force he intended, and even he seemed aware of it as soon as the words left his mouth. One of the newcomers briefly shifted their gaze toward him, not responding, not acknowledging, simply observing before redirecting focus toward Emily. That single moment of attention change altered the entire room dynamic, as Marcus realized he was no longer the center of anything. Emily's fingers relaxed slightly, and she gave a faint nod that was almost imperceptible, not toward Marcus, but toward the group that had entered, as if confirming identity rather than reacting to it. The veteran exhaled slowly and took a small step to the side, allowing the space between Emily and the entrance to remain clear, signaling silent confirmation that the expected recognition sequence was now active. The lead figure inside the doorway finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled, asking for confirmation of identity, using a tone that suggested prior knowledge rather than uncertainty. Marcus looked between Emily and the group, confusion now replacing arrogance, as he tried to reconcile the shift in power happening in real time without explanation. Emily finally raised her eyes fully toward the entrance, meeting the gaze of the lead figure without hesitation. And in that brief exchange, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a name that would redefine everything they thought they understood about the person sitting quietly in the corner. The entire diner remained locked in a silence so precise that even the faint sound of the harbor outside felt distant, as if the world beyond the glass had temporarily lost its connection to the room. Emily Carter maintained steady eye contact with the lead figure at the entrance, her expression unchanged, but carrying a depth of recognition that suggested she was no longer waiting for confirmation, only acknowledgment. Marcus Hale stood rigid near the table, his earlier attempts at control completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet tension in his jaw as he tried to interpret a situation that was no longer responding to intimidation or authority. The veteran remained slightly to the side, no longer the center of attention, but visibly attentive, as if confirming every detail unfolding in front of him against something he had already understood long before anyone else in the room. The lead figure inside the entrance took a slow step forward, his posture steady and deliberate, and repeated the question in a calm voice that carried neither doubt nor aggression, asking for final confirmation of identity. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath and adjusted her position slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if aligning herself with something internal and long settled. Marcus looked between her and the group, frustration giving way to confusion, as he realized that no one was acknowledging his presence anymore, not because they were ignoring him, but because he no longer represented relevance in the situation. One of the figures near the entrance subtly nodded, as if receiving silent confirmation through observation alone, and then shifted their stance to face Emily more directly. The The veteran finally spoke in a low voice, not directed at anyone in particular, stating that certain names did not require explanation once verified at this level of recognition. Emily's gaze remained steady, and for the first time, she gave a slight and controlled nod toward the lead figure, acknowledging the confirmation without hesitation. The lead figure then lowered his head briefly, a restrained gesture that carried more meaning than words, and the rest of the group adjusted their posture in subtle synchronization, signaling a shift in recognition that was now complete. Marcus stepped back half a pace without realizing it, his confidence fully replaced by uncertainty, as he understood that whatever was happening was not a negotiation, nor a confrontation, but a formal acknowledgment of something far beyond his understanding. The diner remained completely silent as the recognition settled into final form, and every person inside instinctively understood that the identity of the woman sitting calmly in the corner had just been fully confirmed at the highest level present in the room. The recognition inside the diner had reached a point where silence was no longer uncertainty, but confirmation, as every person present now understood that what stood in front of them was not an unfolding confrontation, but a formal acknowledgment of identity at a level beyond their everyday reality. Emily Carter remained seated, her posture calm and composed, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, not pride, not fear, but acceptance, as if she had carried this moment with her long before it physically arrived. The lead figure inside the entrance took one final step forward, then stopped at a respectful distance, his stance controlled and deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a lowered tone that suggested final verification rather than inquiry. Marcus Hale stood frozen near the table, his earlier confidence completely eroded, his eyes moving between Emily and the group as if searching for a version of the situation that still allowed him relevance, but finding none. The veteran remained still, watching the exchange with quiet understanding, as though every second confirmed something he had already suspected from the moment he saw the tag. One of the figures from the group slowly adjusted his position, aligning with the lead figure, and the movement alone signaled that internal confirmation had already taken place across the team. The lead figure then addressed Emily directly, stating her name with precision and following it with a reference that caused the room to tighten further into silence, as if the air itself had become heavier with meaning. Emily gave a small and controlled nod, acknowledging the identification without additional words, and that simple gesture completed the recognition sequence more decisively than any explanation could have. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, his mind struggling to reconcile authority, power, and identity collapsing around him in real time, as he realized he had been speaking to someone far outside his understanding of the situation. The veteran lowered his gaze briefly, then looked toward the entrance again, stating quietly that confirmation at this level was irreversible, and that everything that followed would now proceed according to protocol rather than conflict. The figures inside the diner subtly adjusted their formation, no longer searching or assessing, but transitioning into a posture of respect and acknowledgment. Emily finally spoke a single calm sentence, her voice steady and unshaken, not explaining, not defending, but simply confirming presence. In that moment, Marcus fully understood that nothing he had done or said carried weight anymore, because the entire room had shifted its understanding of who held the real center of gravity, and it was no longer him. The atmosphere inside the diner had reached a complete stillness, not the kind created by fear alone, but the kind that comes when every person present understands they are witnessing something final and irreversible. Emily Carter remained seated at the corner table, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a quiet authority that had not been visible before, as if the room had finally caught up to what she had always been. The group that entered had fully settled into formation, no longer scanning or assessing, but standing in a controlled and respectful alignment that confirmed recognition had already completed its final stage. The lead figure took one measured step forward and spoke again, this time not asking, not confirming, but stating Emily's identity with full acknowledgement, followed by a brief reference to a past operation designation that caused a visible shift in posture among his team. Marcus Hale stood near the table, no longer attempting to speak or assert control, his earlier aggression replaced by confusion and disbelief as he realized that every assumption he had made about the situation had collapsed at once. The veteran remained still, watching the exchange with a calm expression, as if this moment had been anticipated long before anyone else understood its significance. Emily gave a slow, controlled nod, acknowledging the statement without adding explanation, and that single gesture completed the final stage of recognition more effectively than any further confirmation could have. The lead figure then adjusted his stance and raised his hand in a restrained formal salute, not theatrical, but precise and deliberate, and the rest of his team followed in quiet synchronization. The diner remained completely silent as this acknowledgement held for several seconds, turning what had begun as confrontation into formal respect. Marcus slowly stepped back, his attention dropping toward the floor as he tried to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he understood, realizing now that he had been in the presence of someone whose history extended far beyond the visible moment. Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady and calm, stating that she had not returned for recognition but for closure, and that simple statement carried more weight than any explanation in the room. The veteran lowered his head slightly, acknowledging the meaning behind her words, while the group near the entrance remained still, fully aware that their role was no longer to act, but to honor what had already been confirmed. The silence that followed was no longer tension, but resolution, as every person inside the diner understood that the situation had fully shifted into a state of respect that could not be undone. The diner remained in a state of complete stillness, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of what had already been confirmed inside the room. Emily Carter sat unchanged at the corner table, her expression calm, her posture steady, but now every detail of her presence carried a quiet authority that no longer required explanation. The group that had entered earlier maintained their respectful formation, no longer scanning or reacting, but standing in a disciplined stillness that reflected full internal confirmation. The lead figure remained slightly forward of his team, his attention fixed on Emily with a composed expression that suggested final acknowledgement rather than uncertainty. Marcus Hale stood several feet back from the table now, his earlier confidence completely absent, replaced by a silent realization that every attempt he had made to assert control had been irrelevant from the beginning. The veteran remained near Emily's side, but slightly behind her, his stance relaxed yet attentive, as if he understood that what was unfolding was not confrontation, but formal recognition at the highest level. The lead figure finally spoke again, his voice low and steady, not addressing the room, but confirming directly to Emily that the acknowledgement had been logged and verified at command level. At the mention of command, a subtle shift moved through the group behind him, each member adjusting their posture in quiet synchronization, reinforcing that the recognition was official and complete. Emily gave a small, controlled nod, acknowledging the statement without emotion, as if accepting something long anticipated rather than newly revealed. Marcus looked up briefly, his face tense, but he did not speak, as there was nothing left in the room that responded to his authority. The veteran slowly exhaled and turned his gaze toward Marcus for a moment, not with aggression, but with the calm understanding of someone witnessing a reversal that could not be undone. The lead figure then gave a final brief gesture to his team, signaling closure of protocol, and the formation behind him subtly shifted into a more relaxed but still respectful stance. Emily's voice broke the silence again, quiet and precise, stating that the situation did not require further escalation and that she would proceed without additional support. The words were simple, but they carried finality, and the team responded with a restrained acknowledgement that confirmed acceptance. Marcus lowered his gaze completely, no longer attempting to interpret or challenge what he was witnessing, as the full weight of recognition settled across the room. The diner, once tense and uncertain, now held a different kind of silence, one defined not by fear or confusion, but by complete acknowledgment of a truth that had already been decided long before. Anyone entered the building. The silence inside the diner had fully transformed into something final and resolved, as if every breath taken in the room now belonged to a moment of acknowledgment rather than uncertainty. Emily Carter remained seated at the corner table, her posture unchanged, but the weight of recognition around her had shifted into something deeper, something closer to respect that no longer required verification. The group of Navy SEALs stood in disciplined stillness, their formation relaxed but maintained with quiet precision, as if awaiting only the final emotional closure of a situation already confirmed at every official level. The lead figure stepped slightly forward, his voice lowered and steady, no longer procedural, but personal, as he acknowledged what had been recorded in their operational history under the designation Black Anchor. At the mention of that name, the veteran beside Emily lowered his gaze briefly, as if recalling a moment long buried in memory, while Emily herself remained composed, her expression calm, but carrying a depth that suggested the weight of years behind it. Marcus Hale stood several steps away now, no longer part of the interaction. His presence reduced to silence as he finally understood that nothing he had said or done mattered in the framework of what had just been confirmed. The lead SEAL continued, stating in clear and respectful terms that Emily Carter's actions during that operation had ensured the survival and safe extraction of an entire unit under conditions that were never publicly documented, and that her role had remained classified due to the nature of the mission. A subtle shift moved through the team as he spoke, several of them straightening slightly, not in tension, but an acknowledgment of shared memory. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and controlled, stating that what mattered was not the recognition itself, but that the people she had worked to protect were still standing there today. The simplicity of her words carried more weight than any formal report, and for a brief moment, the entire room felt anchored to that truth. The lead figure nodded slowly, confirming that understanding. And then, without further instruction, the entire team performed a restrained and unified gesture of respect, acknowledging her without spectacle, but with full sincerity. Marcus lowered his head completely, no longer attempting to interpret anything, as the realization settled that he had been standing in the presence of someone whose history extended far beyond what he could comprehend. The veteran exhaled quietly, his expression steady, as if confirming that some names were never meant to be forgotten once they were finally understood. Emily remained still, her presence calm and grounded, as the final layer of recognition settled into place across the room, leaving only a quiet understanding that respect, once earned at this level, did not need to be spoken to remain absolute. The diner remained completely still, as if even the passage of time had paused to allow the final weight of recognition to settle across every corner of the room. Emily Carter stayed seated at the corner table, her posture calm and unwavering, her presence now no longer questioned by anyone who remained inside. The Navy SEAL team stood in quiet formation, their earlier operational stance softened into one of full acknowledgment, as the final stage of confirmation had already been completed and accepted without dispute. The lead figure took one last measured step forward, his voice steady but lowered, stating that all verification regarding Black Anchor had been finalized and archived under full command acknowledgment, confirming Emily Carter's role in the outcome without further ambiguity. At his words, a subtle shift passed through his team, not of movement, but of collective understanding, as if a long-standing chapter in their history had been formally closed and recognized in its entirety. Emily gave a slow and composed nod, acknowledging the statement without adding further detail, her expression remaining calm, as if closure had always been the intended destination rather than recognition itself. Marcus Hale stood at the edge of the room, completely silent now, his earlier aggression and authority reduced to irrelevance, as he finally understood that nothing he had done or said carried any weight within the framework of what had just been confirmed. The veteran beside Emily lowered his head briefly, then exhaled slowly, his expression carrying a quiet understanding that certain truths only revealed themselves fully when the moment demanded it. The lead figure then gave a final respectful gesture to Emily, followed by his team, who mirrored it in restrained synchronization, signaling complete acknowledgment without ceremony or spectacle. Emily finally spoke one last time, her voice calm and steady, stating that her intention had never been recognition, but completion of what had been left unfinished long ago. Those words settled across the room like a final seal on everything that had occurred, removing any remaining uncertainty from the moment. Marcus looked up briefly, but there was nothing left for him to interpret, no authority left to assert, and no narrative left for him to control. The SEAL team slowly adjusted their formation, preparing to depart with the same discipline with which they had arrived, leaving behind only respect and silence. As they turned toward the entrance, the veteran remained still, watching them go with a steady expression, while Emily continued to sit quietly, no longer as someone being defined by recognition, but as someone whose history had already spoken for itself in full. The door finally opened again, and as the team exited into the harbor light outside, the diner remained unchanged in structure but completely transformed in meaning, as every person inside understood that they had just witnessed not an ending of conflict, but the final confirmation of a legacy that required no further explanation. Some people carry greatness so quietly that the world mistakes it for weakness. If this story reminded you never to judge someone by appearances, please like this video, share it with someone who would appreciate its message, and subscribe for more stories of hidden courage, sacrifice, and respect. Until next time, remember, the strongest people are often the ones the world overlooks.